The stars looked the same as they always had, but Admiral Zethger knew better. War was coming to this part of space again. He stood on the bridge of his massive ship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the screens that showed enemy ships moving closer. The enemy was the Corvani Empire. They had been fighting the Coalition for over 200 years now. It was a long war, but not a terrible one. Both sides knew the rules. They would fight, some ships would be damaged, a few people would die, and then both sides would go back to their bases. It happened like this every few months. Zethger was not worried. His fleet had the best ships in the galaxy. The Taraxian soldiers were strong and brave. The Volthari battle cruisers had powerful weapons. The Nexari fighting robots never got tired or scared. Together, they made a perfect fighting force. "Sir," called his aide from across the bridge, "the human ships are asking for permission to join the observation zone." Zethger looked at the small dots on his screen that showed the human fleet. 12 tiny ships from a planet called Earth. The humans were new to space travel. Their ships looked old and rough compared to the beautiful vessels of the Coalition races. "Let them watch," Zethger said. "Maybe they will learn something about proper warfare." Far across the battlefield, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, the U's Resilience. He was looking at the same battle screens, but he did not like what he saw. The Coalition ships moved in perfect lines. Every ship knew exactly where to go. Every formation was textbook perfect. "They fight like they are dancing," Morrison said to himself. Lieutenant Amy Chun looked up from her station. "Sir, what did you say?" "Nothing important," Morrison replied. But he kept watching the enemy ships. They were moving just as perfectly as the Coalition. Both sides seemed to know exactly what the other would do. Morrison had been a soldier for 20 years before he became a ship captain. He had fought in 3 different wars on Earth. Those wars had been nothing like this. When people fought on Earth, they fought to win. They did whatever it took. There were no perfect formations or polite rules. On the planet below the space battle, Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendez was leading his squad through an empty research station. The Coalition had sent them to search the buildings and look for enemy soldiers. But Mendez was not following the standard search pattern that the Coalition taught. Instead, his men moved in ways that seemed random. Private Lisa Rodriguez watched a doorway that the manual said was not important. Corporal Danny Parks stayed back when he should have moved forward, but Mendez knew what he was doing. He had learned these tricks fighting in the cities of Earth. "This place is too quiet," Rodriguez whispered into her radio. "It feels wrong." Mendez agreed. The building felt like a trap, but not the kind of trap that the Coalition or the Corvani usually made. Their traps were obvious and easy to avoid if you knew the rules. This felt different. "Stay sharp," Mendez told his squad. "Something is not right here." Back in space, the first battle began. The Coalition ships moved forward in their perfect formation. The Corvani ships responded with their own perfect counter-formation. Laser beams flashed between the fleets. Shields glowed bright blue as they absorbed the energy blasts. Morrison watched it all with growing frustration. "How many hits on the enemy flagship?" he asked his weapons officer. 17 direct hits, sir," came the reply. "Damage to their ship?" "Minimal, sir. Their shields are holding." "And how many hits have we taken?" 15, sir. Our shields are also holding." Morrison shook his head. This was not a battle. It was a show. Both sides were following rules that made sure nobody got hurt too badly. The enemy flagship could have been destroyed with a concentrated attack from multiple ships. But that would break the rules of proper warfare. The battle continued for 3 hours. When it was over, both fleets pulled back to safe distances. The casualty reports came in. 2 Coalition ships lightly damaged, 1 Corvani ship with minor hull damage. No one had died. Admiral Zethger was pleased with the results. A successful engagement, he announced to his officers. Minimal losses, objectives achieved. But Captain Morrison felt sick. In the briefing room of his ship, he talked to his senior officers about what they had seen. "We are not fighting a war," Morrison said. "We are playing a game." Commander Helen Price, his second-in-command, leaned forward. "What do you mean, sir?" Morrison stood up and walked to the big screen that showed the battle zone. "Look at this. Both sides know exactly what the other will do. The enemy moves their ships to position A, so our ships move to position B. Then they move to position C, so we move to position D. It is like a dance where everyone knows the steps." "But that is how space warfare works," said Lieutenant Commander Alex Turner. "Both sides use the same tactical manuals, the same training, the same rules." "That is the problem," Morrison replied. "On Earth, we learned that when everyone follows the same rules, nobody wins." Price looked confused. "But the rules prevent unnecessary casualties. They keep the war from becoming too destructive." Morrison thought about the wars he had fought on Earth. The American Civil War, where brothers killed brothers. World War II, where entire cities were destroyed. Vietnam, where soldiers fought in jungles for years. None of those wars had been polite or civilized. "Sometimes," Morrison said quietly, "war is supposed to be destructive. Sometimes that is the only way it ends." His officers looked at each other with worried expressions. They were starting to understand that their captain was thinking about something dangerous. Meanwhile, on the coalition command station called Harmony's Edge, the war leaders were meeting to discuss the battle. General Fax of the Taraxian Defense Force was showing charts and numbers on a big screen. "Based on today's engagement," Fax said, "we can expect this conflict to continue for approximately 17 more years. Our losses will remain below acceptable levels." The other leaders nodded in agreement. 17 years sounded reasonable. It would give both sides time to develop new technologies and train new soldiers. The war would continue, but in a civilized way. Admiral Zethger was satisfied with the plan. "The warfare accords will be maintained," he said. "Both sides will honor the traditional limits on destruction and casualties." But none of them noticed that Captain Morrison was also in the meeting room, sitting at the small table reserved for observers. And Morrison was not satisfied at all. After the meeting, Morrison found himself alone with Lieutenant Colonel Beth Harris, Earth's military attached to the coalition. They stood together on the observation deck, watching the distant flashes of another polite battle between the two fleets. 17 years, Morrison said. They want to fight this war for 17 more years. Harris had been a soldier on Earth before coming to space. She had fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. She understood what Morrison was feeling. "It is not like our wars," she said. "No," Morrison agreed. "Our wars ended when one side could not fight anymore. These people do not want to win. They just want to keep fighting forever." Harris thought about her grandfather, who had fought in World War II. He used to tell her stories about battles where soldiers fought until they had no ammunition left, then fought with knives and bare hands. The idea of stopping a battle because you had reached an acceptable casualty limit would have seemed insane to him. "Maybe that is why they asked us to come," Morrison said. "Maybe they need to remember what real war looks like." Harris looked at him with concern. "Jake, what are you thinking?" Morrison did not answer right away. He was thinking about Earth's long history of warfare, about the generals who had won wars by breaking all the rules, about soldiers who had fought impossible battles because surrender was not an option. "I am thinking," he finally said, "that these people have forgotten what they are fighting for." The next day brought news that would change everything. Long-range scouts reported that the Corvani Empire was building up massive forces near Nexus Station, the most important strategic location in this part of space. It controlled the main travel routes between star systems and served as the Coalition's primary supply base. Admiral Zethker received the report with calm interest. Standard buildup, he concluded after studying the numbers. They will probably attack within the next few weeks. We will respond with standard defensive deployments. But Captain Morrison looked at the same report and saw something different. The Corvani were not following their usual patterns. They had committed 3 times as many ships as normal. This was not going to be another polite battle. "Sir," Morrison said to Admiral Zethker during the next briefing, "I think the enemy is planning something new." Zethker dismissed his concern with a wave. The Corvani have followed the same tactical doctrine for 3 centuries. They are incapable of innovation. Morrison wanted to argue, but he was just an observer. The coalition leaders would not listen to warnings from the primitive humans. They were too confident in their perfect understanding of how war worked. But Morrison had learned something. During his years of fighting on Earth, the enemy always gets a vote. And he had a feeling that the Corvani were about to vote for something that would shock the entire galaxy. As the human ships took their positions in the observation zone, Morrison made a decision that would change the course of the war. He sent a coded message to all 12 human ships. Prepare for active operations. His officer. The Coalition War Council met in the largest room on Harmony's Edge space station. Representatives from 6 different alien species sat around a circular table that was bigger than most houses. Each species looked different, but they all shared the same calm confidence about the coming battle. General Thax of the Taraxian Defense Force stood at the front of the room. His people looked like giant lizards, but they were known throughout the galaxy as brilliant military strategists. Behind him, a holographic display showed casualty projections and battle timelines. "Based on our analysis," Thax said in his deep, rumbling voice, "the Corvani buildup near Nexus Station represents a standard escalation pattern. We project a conflict duration of 17 years, with acceptable losses maintained below 12% of fleet strength annually." The other alien leaders nodded their approval. Admiral Corvin of the Voltheri fleet, whose people looked like tall blue-skinned elves, spoke next. "The warfare accords will be maintained throughout the conflict. Both sides understand the importance of civilized combat," Admiral Zethker agreed. "A sustainable approach that honors our ancient traditions of proper warfare." Captain Morrison sat at a small table near the back of the room, designated for observers. Next to him sat Lieutenant Colonel Beth Harris, Earth's military attaché. Both humans listened to the discussion with growing disbelief. 17 years, Morrison whispered to Harris. "They are actually planning to fight the same battle over and over again for 17 years. Harris had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan before humanity reached the stars. The idea of planning a war to last nearly 2 decades while keeping casualties to acceptable levels seemed insane to her. "On Earth," she whispered back, "wars lasted as long as they had to last, not as long as some committee decided was reasonable." After the formal meeting ended, Morrison and Harris found themselves alone on the station's observation deck. Through the massive windows, they could see the distant flashes of another engagement between Coalition and Corvani forces. Even from millions of miles away, the battle looked like a light show rather than a life or death struggle. "Tell me about the longest war America ever fought," Morrison said suddenly. Harris thought for a moment. "Afghanistan, 20 years. But it was not like this. It was not choreographed. And before that, Vietnam. My grandfather served there." She paused, remembering the stories her family had told. "He used to say the worst thing about that war was not the fighting. It was that nobody wanted to win badly enough to do what winning required." Morrison nodded. He had studied Earth's military history extensively. The American Civil War had consumed an entire generation. 2 world wars had reshaped human civilization. Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each conflict had taught humanity hard lessons about the true nature of warfare. These alien species, Morrison said, they have evolved beyond that kind of fighting. War has become polite for them. Maybe that is why they keep losing. Harris replied. The truth was that neither the Coalition nor the Corvani Empire had actually won a significant victory in over a century. Every battle ended in tactical draws. Every war concluded with negotiated settlements that left both sides in roughly the same position they had started in. On the bridge of the UES Defiance, Commander Nick Thompson was reviewing intelligence reports from Earth Command. The message had arrived through the Deep Space Communication Network, and its contents were classified at the highest levels. Thompson called his senior staff to the briefing room. Around the table sat Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, the ship's tactical officer, Major Frank Rivera, the Marine commander, and several other key personnel. Command wants a full tactical assessment of both Coalition and Corvani capabilities, Thompson told them. They want to know why this war has been going on for 200 years with no clear victor. Lieutenant Commander Kim activated the holographic display. The 3-dimensional map showed the positions of both fleets, with detailed analysis of their weapons, shields, and tactical formations. Both sides follow extremely rigid engagement protocols, Kim explained. Maximum engagement range is maintained at all times. Minimum risk strategies are employed exclusively. Predetermined withdrawal conditions are strictly observed. What about casualties? Asked Major Rivera. Consistently below 1% per engagement, Kim replied, for both sides. Rivera exchanged glances with the other officers. In the wars he had studied on Earth, 1% casualties were not even worth reporting. They were background noise, not the decisive factor in ending battles. Command is also interested in our assessment of Corvani's strategic objectives, Thompson continued. That is the problem, sir, Kim said. They do not seem to have any clear objectives. Neither side does. They fight to fight, not to achieve anything specific. The concept was difficult for the human officers to understand. Every war in Earth's history had been fought for specific goals: territory, resources, political control, or survival itself. The idea of fighting a war just to maintain the status quo was alien to human thinking. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, the Corvani flagship Inevitable Victory maintained its position in the contested zone. The ship was massive, even larger than the Coalition's command vessels, and bristled with weapons that could destroy entire planets. Supreme Commander Vextel stood on his bridge, reviewing reports from the latest engagement. His species looked like giant insects, with multiple arms and compound eyes that could track dozens of targets simultaneously. But despite their frightening appearance, the Corvani followed the same civilized warfare protocols as everyone else. The Coalition performed exactly as doctrine predicted, Vextel reported to his staff. Their new human observers maintained proper rear positions throughout the engagement. No deviation from standard protocols. Sub-Commander Krender, whose carapace was darker than his superiors, asked the question that had been bothering many. Corvani officers, Supreme Commander, why do we continue these engagements? We achieve no significant gains, and neither do they. Vextel considered the question carefully. Because it is the way things have always been done. The warfare accords maintain peace and stability throughout the galaxy. Without them, wars would become chaotic and destructive. But privately, Vextel was beginning to wonder if there might be another way. The constant cycle of attack and counterattack, advance and retreat, victory and stalemate was becoming tiresome even for a species known for their patience. Back on Harmony's edge, Morrison found himself unable to sleep. He walked through the station's corridors, past quarters housing officers from dozens of different species. The station was like a small city in space, home to nearly 50,000 military personnel from across the galaxy. In the station's historical archives, Morrison discovered something that shocked him. The current war between the Coalition and the Corvani Empire was not unique. Similar conflicts had been going on throughout the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Different species, different star systems, but always the same pattern. Long, polite. Wars that never really ended. The archives contain detailed records of the Warfare Accords, a set of treaties and agreements that governed how civilized species conducted military operations. The rules were extensive and detailed, covering everything from acceptable casualty rates to proper treatment of prisoners to limits on weapons technology. It is like they turned war into a sport, Morrison muttered to himself as he read through. The documents but as he dug deeper into the historical records, Morrison found something troubling. The galaxy had not always been this peaceful. Thousands of years ago, before the Warfare Accords were established, wars had been brutal and decisive. Entire civilizations had been destroyed. Planets had been rendered uninhabitable. Billions had died in conflicts that lasted only months or years instead of centuries. The Warfare Accords had been created to prevent such tragedies from happening again. They had succeeded in making war more civilized, but they had also made it eternal. The next morning, Morrison attended another briefing on the Corvani buildup near Nexus Station. The intelligence reports were concerning. The enemy had positioned nearly 300 ships in the area, far more than any previous engagement. Admiral Zefker reviewed the data with typical calm. A larger force than usual, but still within acceptable parameters for defensive response. We will deploy our standard fleet configuration and engage according to established protocols. But Morrison saw something in the data that the Coalition leaders had missed. The Corvani ship positions were not following their usual patterns. Instead of the symmetrical formations they typically used, their fleet was arranged in an aggressive assault configuration. "Sir," Morrison spoke up during the briefing, "I believe the enemy may be planning to deviate from standard engagement protocols." Zethker looked at him with mild annoyance. "Captain Morrison, the Corvani have followed the same tactical doctrine for 3 centuries. They are constitutionally incapable of innovation. But their formation suggests their formation is irrelevant," Zefker interrupted. "They will engage at maximum range, exchange fire for the appropriate duration, and withdraw when casualties reach acceptable levels. This is how galactic warfare has been conducted for 1,000 years." Morrison wanted to argue further, but he could see that the Coalition The crisis began on what should have been just another routine patrol mission. Commodore Yelthara of the Volthari fleet was leading a standard reconnaissance force when her sensors detected something that made her blood run cold. Near Nexus Station, the most important strategic location in this part of space, the Corvani Empire had assembled the largest battle fleet anyone had seen in over 50 years. "Communications, send an immediate alert to Coalition Command," Yelthara ordered from the Yelthar bridge of her flagship. Her crew moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had performed these same duties hundreds of times before. The response from Admiral Zethker was swift and predictable. "Deploy standard defensive formations. All fleet units will assume textbook positions according to Defensive Protocol 7 Alpha." Yelthara watched her fleet arrange itself in the perfect defensive formation that had been used successfully for decades. Every ship knew exactly where to go. Every captain understood their role. It was beautiful in its precision and order, but something felt different this time. The Corvani forces were not responding with their usual counterformation. Instead, they continued to mass ships in aggressive attack positions that seemed designed for something far more serious than the typical polite engagement. Captain Morrison watched the developing situation from the bridge of the UE's Vigilant. His ship was positioned in the observation zone with the other human vessels, far from the main battle area. But his sensors were just as good as anyone else's, and what he saw made him deeply worried. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Alex Turner called. "From the sensor station, I am reading massive energy signatures from the Corvani formation. That is not their standard battle configuration." Morrison studied the tactical display with growing alarm. The enemy fleet was arranged in a way that suggested they were not planning another ritualized engagement. They were planning to win. "They are not going to follow the rules this time," Morrison said quietly. Turner looked confused. "Sir, what rules?" "The unwritten rules that say both sides pull back when casualties get too high. The rules that keep these wars going forever without anyone actually winning." Morrison paused, thinking about what he was seeing. "I think the Corvani had decided to break those rules." The battle began exactly like all the others. Long-range energy exchanges between the opposing fleets. Precise formations moving in predictable patterns. Laser beams and particle weapons creating spectacular light shows in the darkness of space. But as the hours passed, something unprecedented happened. The Corvani forces did not withdraw when they reached their normal casualty threshold. Instead, they pressed forward with relentless determination. Aboard the coalition flagship Eternal Harmony, Admiral Zithker watched his casualty reports with growing confusion and alarm. "They should have withdrawn by now," he said to his staff. "This exceeds all acceptable loss parameters." "Sir," his communications officer reported, "Corvani forces are maintaining full attack posture despite reaching 8% casualties." 8%. In the civilized warfare of the galaxy, that was a catastrophic loss rate that should have triggered immediate withdrawal and peace negotiations. No civilized species was supposed to accept such losses for any strategic objective. The Corvani pressed their advantage. Supreme Commander Vextel had made a decision that surprised even his own officers. He was going to break the ancient patterns of ritualized warfare that had governed galactic conflict for 1,000 years. "Continue the assault," Vextel ordered from his flagship. "Today we end this eternal stalemate." The coalition forces began to crumble. Centuries of fighting by rules and conventions had left them completely unprepared for an enemy willing to absorb heavy losses in pursuit of actual victory. Ship after ship fell back as their commanders found themselves in situations that their training had never covered. Captain Rodriguez of the Taraxian heavy cruiser Steadfast sent an urgent message. "To Fleet Command, we have lost shield integrity and suffered severe hull damage. Requesting permission to withdraw according to standard protocol." But there was no standard protocol for what was happening. The enemy was not allowing orderly withdrawals. They were pursuing damaged ships and trying to destroy them completely. Nexus. Station's defensive systems came under sustained assault for the first time in decades. The massive space station had always been considered safe because both sides understood that destroying such strategic installations would escalate the conflict beyond acceptable levels. But the Corvani were no longer interested in acceptable levels. Captain Morrison made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. "All ships," he broadcast on the human fleet frequency. "New orders. We are going active." Commander Helen Price turned to him in shock. "Sir, we are observers. We do not have authorization to engage in combat operations." "The coalition is about to lose their most important strategic asset," Morrison replied with cold determination. "And these people have forgotten how to fight a real war." Lieutenant Colonel Beth Harris, aboard the UES Guardian, received Morrison's transmission with grim understanding. She had seen this kind of situation before in Afghanistan. When well-trained conventional forces found themselves facing an enemy who refused to follow the established rules of engagement. All Marine units, she broadcast to the human ground forces, prepare for immediate combat deployment. We are about to show these people what Earth's children learned in the mud. The 12 human ships moved out of their observation positions with a speed and aggression that caught both Coalition and Corvani forces completely off guard. Their movement patterns were unlike anything in the tactical databases of either side. Instead of the graceful, predictable formations that characterized galactic warfare, the human ships moved in ways that seemed chaotic but were devastatingly effective. They scattered and reformed, advanced and retreated, concentrated and dispersed in patterns that made tactical prediction impossible. Morrison's voice cut through the Osso Coalition command frequency with an authority that silenced all other communications. This is Captain Morrison of the Earth Fleet. We are taking operational command of this engagement. Admiral Zithkar's response was immediate and outraged. You have no authority to take command of Coalition forces. I have the authority of necessity, Morrison replied with ice-cold calm. Your people are about to lose this war because you have forgotten what war actually is. The human fleet struck the Corvani forces like a force of nature, but they did not engage in the long-range energy exchanges that characterized normal space combat. Instead, they closed to ranges that other species considered suicidal. Sir, called Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim from the tactical station of the UES Defiance, we are taking heavy fire at this range. Shields are down to 60%. Commander Nick Thompson, the ship's captain, showed no concern. Maintain course. Frank, are your Marines ready? Major Frank Rivera grinned with the confidence of a man whose great-grandfather had fought at Iwo Jima. Born ready, sir. The concept that Rivera was preparing to implement had been abandoned by Galactic civilization centuries ago. Boarding actions were considered too risky, too unpredictable, and too brutal for civilized warfare. But Rivera's Marines had trained for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat. Boarding teams away, Rivera reported as assault shuttles launched. From human ships across the battle zone, the Corvani crews had never encountered anything like what happened next. Human Marines cut through ship hulls with weapons and techniques that seemed primitive but were brutally effective. They moved through alien corridors with tactical awareness, born from urban warfare in places like Fallujah and Ramadi Staff Sergeant. Carlos Mendez led his squad through the corridors of the Corvani heavy cruiser, Dominant Fist. The ship's security forces fought bravely, but they were trained for the ritualized combat that had characterized space warfare for generations. Were not prepared for enemies who fought with the focused aggression of soldiers, who viewed every engagement as potentially their last. Rodriguez placed demo charges on the reactor access. Mendez ordered, "Park, secure the bridge approach." Juleson, establish overwatch on the main corridor. Private Lisa Rodriguez moved with the efficiency of someone whose training had been forged in conflicts where hesitation meant death. The Corvani defenders tried to stop her, but their weapons and tactics were designed for the polite warfare of the galaxy, not the brutal efficiency of human military doctrine. The boarding actions succeeded beyond all expectations. Within 4 hours, 6 Corvani heavy cruisers had been captured or disabled by human Marines. The tactical balance of the engagement shifted dramatically in favor of the Coalition, but the real shock came when the other Coalition forces witnessed how humans treated their prisoners. Supreme Commander Vextel found himself aboard the UES, vigilant, expecting the ritualized imprisonment that characterized civilized warfare. Instead, Captain Morrison offered him coffee and a chair in the ship's briefing room. "You are not going to execute me?" Vextel asked, his compound eyes showing genuine confusion. Morrison looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would I execute you? You are a prisoner of war." but I violated the warfare accords. I continued fighting beyond acceptable casualty parameters. My forces caused significant destruction to Coalition assets. So did. The news of what happened at Nexus Station spread across the galaxy like wildfire. For the first time in over 200 years, one side had achieved a complete and decisive victory. The Coalition had not just won a battle, they had captured the enemy's most important strategic position and forced them to retreat completely. But it was not the Coalition forces who had won the battle. It was 12 small ships from a planet that most galactic citizens had never heard of. Admiral Zithker stood in his private quarters aboard the Eternal Dominion, staring at the battle reports that seemed impossible to believe. The human ships had done things that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They had closed to suicidal ranges. They had boarded enemy vessels like ancient pirates. They had fought with a brutality that shocked even veteran military officers. And they had won. Sir, his aide entered the room carefully. The Coalition High Command is requesting a full debriefing on human tactical capabilities. Zethker turned from the window where he had been watching the human ships in the distance. What do you want me to tell them? That 12 primitive vessels accomplished what our entire fleet could not? The aide was silent. There was no good answer to that question. Meanwhile, on Earth, the news was being received with very different emotions. In the Pentagon, General Patricia Wells was reading classified reports from the battle with growing amazement. They did what? She asked her aide, Colonel Robert Hayes. They took operational command of a Coalition fleet and won a decisive victory against the Corvani Empire, Hayes replied. Morrison and his people basically taught the entire galaxy how to fight a real war. Wells had spent 30 years in the military, including combat tours in 3 different conflicts. She understood what Morrison had done and why it had been necessary. The question now, she said, is what happens next. We just showed the galaxy that their way of fighting is useless. They are going to want to learn our methods. Back in space, Captain Morrison was dealing with exactly that problem. His ship was being flooded with requests from Coalition officers who wanted to understand human military tactics. Every day brought new messages from admirals and generals across the galaxy. Commander Helen Price brought in the latest batch of communication requests. Sir, we have 17 more requests for tactical briefings. The Taraxian Defense Force wants to send a delegation. The Volthari Navy is asking for training assistance. Even the Nexari robot fleets are requesting data on human combat algorithms. Morrison looked at the list with mixed feelings. What they want to learn took us thousands of years to develop, and it cost us millions of lives. Should I decline the requests? Morrison thought about the choice they faced. They could try to keep human military knowledge secret, but that would not work for long. Or they could teach the galaxy what they knew, and hope that the aliens could handle the responsibility. Schedule the briefings, he decided. But we do this carefully. We are not just teaching them new tactics. We are changing how an entire galaxy thinks about war. The first formal presentation was held aboard Harmony's Edge space station. The main conference room was packed with military officers from dozens of different species. Morrison stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of their expectations. You want to know how we won at Nexus Station? Morrison began. The answer is simple, but you are not going to like it. General Thax of the Taraxian Defense Force leaned forward. Please explain. We stopped fighting like gentlemen, Morrison said. We started fighting like our lives depended on it. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Admiral Corvin of the Volthari fleet raised his hand. But surely there must be tactical innovations we can study. New weapons technologies. Advanced formation strategies. Morrison shook his head. Our ships are primitive compared to yours. Our weapons are less advanced. Our technology is centuries behind what you have developed. But we have something you have forgotten, which is the will to win at any cost. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Harris stood up to support Morrison's explanation. Every human culture has a concept that you do not seem to have in your civilizations. We call it total war. What does that mean? Asked Admiral Zethker. Harris activated the holographic display and showed images from Earth's history. Pictures of devastated cities. Massive armies clashing across continents. Ships burning in harbors. It means fighting until one side cannot fight anymore, Harris explained. It means targeting not just military forces, but the enemy's ability to make war. It means accepting terrible losses, if that is what victory requires. The alien officers looked at the images with horror and fascination. They had never seen warfare conducted on such a scale, or with such intensity. But the casualties, protested General Fax. The destruction. How do civilizations survive such conflicts? Most do not, Morrison said quietly. That is why the ones that do survive learn to fight so hard. Because the alternative is extinction. Commander Nick Thompson, who had been asked to explain human boarding tactics, stepped forward. You asked how we captured 6 Corvani ships in a single battle. The answer is that we were willing to do something you considered impossible, which was risk everything to achieve our objectives. When we launched those boarding parties, we knew that many of our people would die. But we also knew that if we succeeded, we could end the battle quickly and save more lives in the long run. Major Frank Rivera joined the presentation to discuss marine tactics. Your security forces are trained to fight according to rules and protocols. Our Marines are trained to win by any means necessary. The difference in effectiveness is dramatic. The questions continued for hours. The alien officers wanted to understand every aspect of human military thinking, from strategic planning to individual combat techniques. But the more they learned, the more disturbed they became. You are describing a form of warfare that could destroy entire civilizations, Admiral Corvin observed. Yes, Morrison agreed. That is exactly what we are describing. And that is why it works. When both sides know that losing means the end of everything they care about, they fight harder than you can imagine. After the formal presentation, Morrison found himself in private conversations with individual coalition leaders. Each one was struggling to understand how to apply human concepts to their own military forces. Admiral Zethker was particularly troubled. Captain Morrison, I have commanded fleets for 40 years. I have fought in hundreds of engagements. But what you did at Nexus Station, it terrifies me. Why? Because it works too well. If every species adopts these methods, the galaxy will become a much more dangerous place. Morrison nodded. That is the price of effectiveness. Once you know how to fight a real war, you cannot go back to playing games. Meanwhile, in the Corvani Empire, Supreme Commander Vextal was having his own crisis of understanding. The defeat at Nexus Station had shattered everything his people believed about warfare. The Corvani High Command was demanding explanations for how their most powerful fleet had been defeated by a handful of primitive ships. The humans fight like animals, reported Sub-Commander Krender, who had witnessed the boarding actions firsthand. They show no regard for their own safety. They target vital systems without concern for collateral damage. They treat every engagement as if it were their last. Vextal studied the tactical recordings from the battle. Perhaps that is why they win, he said thoughtfully. Within weeks, both Coalition and Corvani military academies were requesting human instructors. Training programs that had remained unchanged for centuries were being completely rewritten. The polite, ritualized warfare that had characterized galactic conflict for 1,000 years was being abandoned in favor of human methods, but the transformation was not without cost. The first battles fought using human tactics resulted in casualty. Rates that shocked both sides. Ships that would have withdrawn under the old rules now fought until they were destroyed. Boarding actions became common, leading to brutal close-quarters combat that left both attackers and defenders traumatized. Captain Morrison received reports of these developments with growing concern. During a staff meeting aboard his ship, he discussed the implications with his senior officers. "We have created a monster," Commander Price observed. "These species are adopting our tactics without understanding the culture that created them." "What do you mean?" asked Lieutenant Commander Turner. "On Earth, we developed these methods over thousands of years of constant warfare. We learned restraint, along with aggression. We understand when to stop fighting as well as when to start. These aliens are learning only the aggressive parts." Morrison realized that teaching the galaxy how to fight effectively was only half the problem. They also needed to learn when not to fight and how to end wars once they had been won. The solution came from an unexpected source. Supreme Commander Vixtel, still a prisoner aboard the human ship, requested a private meeting with Morrison. "Captain," Vextel said, "my people are studying your methods. Soon they will fight as you fight. But I fear they will not know when to stop." Morrison understood the concern. "What are you proposing?" "A new set of accords. Not rules that limit how wars are fought, but principles that determine when they should end. Your people understand. Victory and defeat in ways that we do not. Perhaps you could teach us those concepts as well." 6 months after the Battle of Nexus Station, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Coalition War College, once a quiet institution where alien officers studied ancient tactical manuals, had become humanity's classroom. Every day, hundreds of students from dozens of different species attended lectures given by Earth's veterans. General Patricia Wells stood before an audience of alien military leaders in the college's largest auditorium. Behind her, a massive holographic display showed images from Earth's bloodiest conflicts: Gettysburg, Normandy, Stalingrad, Fallujah. The key difference between human warfare and galactic warfare, Wells explained to the mixed crowd of Taraxian lizards, Voltheri elves, and insectoid Nexari, is that we never forgot what war's true nature is. In the front row, former Admiral Zethker raised his hand. The proud officer who had once commanded the Coalition's largest fleet was now a student, trying to understand how his understanding of warfare had been so completely wrong. "General Wells," Zethker said, "you are saying that predictability is a weakness rather than a strength?" "I am saying that when both sides know exactly what the other will do, victory goes to whoever is willing to pay the higher price," Wells replied, "and your civilizations had forgotten how to pay any price at all." The concept was still difficult for many of the alien students to understand. They had been raised in cultures where war was a form of elaborate diplomacy, where battles were fought according to strict rules that ensured minimal casualties and maximum stability. Commander Nick Thompson taught a course on adaptive tactics in a smaller classroom down the hall. His students were mostly ship captains and fleet commanders who had watched their perfect formations crumble under human assault at Nexus Station. "The moment you become predictable," Thompson told his class, "you have already lost the war. The enemy does not have to outfight you. They just have to wait for you to do what you always do, then counter it." Captain Yeltara of the Voltheri Navy, whose ship had been nearly destroyed in the battle, asked the obvious question: "But how do you maintain unit cohesion without standardized procedures? How do you coordinate fleet movements without predetermined formations?" Thompson smiled. "You train your people to think, not just follow orders. You give them objectives and let them figure out how to achieve them. You trust their judgment instead of trying to control every detail of their actions." The idea was revolutionary to species who had conducted warfare as a form of precise engineering for centuries. But it was proving devastatingly effective when applied against traditional galactic forces. The transformation was not limited to tactics and strategy. Human concepts of military culture were spreading throughout the coalition forces. The idea of unit cohesion, forged through shared hardship rather than formal hierarchy, was changing how alien soldiers related to each other. Major Frank Rivera found himself training mixed species marine units and techniques that his grandfather had learned fighting the Japanese in World War II. In a training facility on Harmony's Edge, he addressed a group that included humans, Taraxians, Valkyrie, and even some Nexari combat robots. "You do not fight for the coalition," Rivera told his diverse unit. "You do not fight for abstract political objectives. You fight for the soldiers standing next to you, whatever species they happen to be." The concept was revolutionary to species, who had conducted warfare as an extension of statcraft for millennia. But when put into practice, it created bonds between soldiers that made them far more effective in combat than traditional military units. Sergeant Bobby Wilson, whose family had a military tradition going back 4 generations, worked with alien troops who were struggling to understand human concepts of loyalty and sacrifice. On Earth, Wilson explained to a group of young Taraxian soldiers, "We have a saying, 'No one left behind.' It means that you never abandon your comrades, no matter how dangerous the situation becomes." One of the Taraxians, a young officer named Krax, asked, "But what if saving one soldier requires risking many others? Is that tactically sound?" Wilson thought about his grandfather's stories from Vietnam, about soldiers who had died trying to rescue wounded comrades from impossible situations. "Maybe not," Wilson admitted, "but it is what makes us human. And it is what makes humans willing to follow each other into situations that would terrify other species." The impact of these cultural changes became clear during the first major. Engagement fought using human principles. When a Corvani raiding force attacked a coalition supply convoy, the defending ships did not follow standard withdrawal procedures when they took heavy damage. Instead, they fought with a desperation and determination that shocked both sides. The battle was over in 3 hours instead of the usual 3 days. The Corvani force was completely destroyed, but the coalition also suffered heavier casualties than any engagement in recent memory. The difference was that this time, the losses had achieved something decisive. Supreme Commander Vextel, still working as a strategic advisor to the coalition, watched the battle reports with amazement. They are not the same armies that fought. 6 months ago, he observed to Captain Morrison during one of their regular meetings. Morrison nodded. They are learning what we have always known. War is not a game with rules. It is a test of will. But the most significant change was happening within the Corvani Empire itself. Faced with this new form of warfare, the Corvani military was undergoing its own transformation. Fleets that had dominated space for millennia suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered by forces that refused to follow established patterns. The Corvani response was swift and dramatic. If the coalition was going to fight like humans, then the Corvani would learn to do the same. Within months, Corvani military academies were studying human tactical manuals and adopting aggressive new strategies. The first engagement between two forces both trained in human methods was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The battle lasted only 6 hours, but the intensity was so fierce that nearby star systems detected the energy signatures from hundreds of light years away. When the fighting ended, one Corvani fleet had been completely destroyed and another had surrendered unconditionally. The idea of negotiated withdrawals and acceptable casualties had been abandoned by both sides. But the most significant change came in how wars themselves were being conducted. Coalition forces, led by human tactical thinking, began targeting not just military assets, but the enemy's ability to make war. Supply lines, communication networks, industrial facilities, all became legitimate targets in a way that horrified traditional galactic military thinking. "You are talking about total war," protested Admiral Corvash of the Nexari fleet during a strategic planning session at Coalition headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Beth Harris, now serving as the Coalition's chief strategic advisor, met his gaze. Steadily, "We are talking about winning." Harris had been promoted after successfully implementing human strategic concepts across multiple theaters of operation. Her approach was simple but effective. Identify the enemy's critical weaknesses and attack them relentlessly until they could no longer fight. The war that the Coalition had originally planned to fight for 17 years was now entering its final phase after only 8 months. The Corvani Empire, faced with an enemy that refused to accept stalemate, was being systematically dismantled. Corvani supply lines were cut by fast-moving Coalition raiders, who struck without warning and disappeared before reinforcements could arrive. Communication networks were jammed or destroyed by cyber warfare techniques that humans had developed during Earth's digital conflicts. Industrial facilities that had operated safely behind the lines for centuries were suddenly prime targets for long-range bombardment. "This is not warfare," complained Corvani Admiral Lextel during a diplomatic communication. "This is destruction for its own sake." Morrison, who was participating in the negotiations as a human representative, responded with cold logic. "This is what warfare looks like when one side is serious about winning. You chose to break the old rules when you attacked Nexus Station. We are simply following your example to its logical conclusion." The final phase of the war came when Coalition forces surrounded the Corvani home system. For the first time in galactic history, a major power faced the possibility of complete conquest rather than negotiated settlement. The Corvani High Command requested emergency peace negotiations, offering terms that would have been unthinkable under the old system of ritualized warfare. They would surrender all contested territories, pay massive reparations, and accept Coalition oversight of their military forces. In the peace negotiations aboard Harmony's Edge, Vexthal sat across from Morrison as representatives of their respective sides. The roles had completely reversed from their first meeting. Now it was Vexthal who needed Morrison's help to end a war that his own side could no longer sustain. "You have changed everything," Vexthal said quietly. "War will never be the same in our galaxy." Morrison thought about the cost of what they had accomplished. Human lives lost, alien soldiers who had died learning new ways to fight the ancient, stability that had been shattered to achieve victory. But he also thought about the alternative, endless conflicts that achieved nothing, wars that continued for centuries without resolution. Maybe that is not empty.